The swamp world of Viridian 4 was supposed to be just another test in the Galactic Academy's survival curriculum, but from the moment the shuttle door opened, the air itself warned of deception. It was heavy and wet, carrying a sweet, rotting scent that clung to the lungs. Thick, greenish fog drifted low across the shallow marshes, and each step sank deeper into the unseen sludge below. The team consisted of 7 cadets, 5 aliens from different species, 1 human, and 1 instructor-observer who never left orbit. What began as confidence quickly dissolved into nervous glances as the group unloaded crates from the shuttle. Every surface around them seemed to quiver as if the ground resented their presence. The human, named Carter, moved slowly, analyzing how each step altered the texture of the mud. The swamp wasn't just wet, it was alive, pulsing faintly beneath the top layer. The alien cadets mocked his hesitation at first. A tall reptilian named Varek laughed, his scaled lips curling back. "What, human? Afraid of mud?" But Carter said nothing. He had seen too many terrains that looked harmless and turned deadly. He crouched and pushed his hand into the sludge. It was warm, unnaturally so, and moved around his fingers like a muscle contracting. He looked up and noticed faint ripples forming even though no wind disturbed the surface. By midday, the team had erected temporary shelters, thin metallic domes anchored with rods. The avian cadet Sarai fluttered her narrow wings nervously. "Humidity will ruin my feathers," she complained, fanning herself with trembling hands. The others ignored her, focused on unloading supplies. Carter worked quietly, helping secure the food containers, but something in the corner of his eye caught his attention. One of the landing pads was slowly tilting. He stepped closer and watched as the edge of a metallic crate began to sink, almost imperceptibly at first, then faster, as though pulled down by invisible fingers. "Stop moving!" he shouted, his voice cutting through the swamp's thick silence. The team froze. The ground beneath them rippled again, broad, circular motions spreading outward from where the crate had disappeared. Within seconds, the surface collapsed inwards. The nearest alien, a blue-skinned amphibian named Ro, screamed as the earth gave way beneath her feet. She plunged waist-deep into the mire. Carter sprinted forward, reaching for her wrist, but the suction was too strong. He jammed a stabilizing pole into the mud and looped a rope around it, pulling with all his strength. Inch by inch, she emerged, gasping and trembling. Behind them, the rest of the camp wasn't so lucky. The main supply tent slumped sideways, one corner vanishing beneath a bubbling pit. Boxes of ration cubes, tools, and batteries slid downward as if swallowed by a breathing mouth. The ground made wet, sucking noises that echoed across the marsh. Panic broke loose. The insectoid twins, Kess and Voro, darted in opposite directions, clicking in alarm. Sarai tried to take flight but slipped on the slick surface, her wings coated with swamp slime. Varek roared, swinging a rod at the ground as though striking it would make it release their things. Carter knew it was useless. The swamp wasn't just unstable, it was predatory. "Back to the ridge!" he shouted, pointing toward a slightly elevated patch of tangled roots nearby. The group obeyed, stumbling through the knee-deep muck while dragging what little they could carry. By the time they reached firmer ground, nearly half their equipment had vanished. Carter turned, panting, and saw the campsite where they had landed was now a glistening, crater-like depression. The mud pulsed once more, then flattened, erasing all evidence of their presence. For a long moment, no one spoke. Only the faint croaks and sloshes of unseen creatures filled the air. Ro sat trembling, her soaked uniform stained with green patches that steamed faintly in the humid air. Varek cursed under his breath, slamming a fist against a tree trunk, while Sarai stared at the horizon where fog thickened into something like a wall. The insectoids whispered in rapid clicks that translated roughly as despair. Carter stood apart from them, breathing slowly, letting his pulse settle. He wasn't trained for this exact planet, but the patterns were familiar. It reminded him of floodplains back on Earth where the soil liquefied when overloaded. He crouched, inspecting the ridge beneath them. It was slightly elevated because of intertwined roots, thicker than any tree roots he had seen, almost like cables. The swamp didn't just consume, it shifted, breathed, and rebuilt itself. "Nothing here is stable," he said quietly. "This whole surface is moving." Varric turned on him, eyes blazing. "Then how do we survive, human genius? Float on air?" "Maybe," Carter replied evenly. "Or something close." As night fell, the fog turned luminous, glowing faintly green as microorganisms drifted upward like sparks. The air buzzed with life, flies, spore clouds, and faint vibrations from beneath. The cadets huddled in a circle around the emergency heater, the only remaining functioning device. Carter stayed awake, sketching crude notes in the dirt with a broken branch. He traced the flow of the swamp's currents from memory, where things had sunk, where the ground held, where the bubbles rose. He realized the swamp didn't consume everything randomly. It was shifting in cycles, digesting soft areas and exhaling gases elsewhere. At dawn, the team awoke to a new horror. Their heater, too, was gone. The place where it had stood was nothing but a thin layer of bubbles, slowly popping in the light. Ro burst into tears, and Sarai muttered that the test was impossible. The reptilian Varric wanted to signal the instructors for extraction, but the emergency beacon was missing with the gear. Panic began to spiral again, but Carter's focus sharpened. The swamp wasn't unbeatable. It was alive, and anything alive could be understood. He picked up a long stick, jabbed it into the mud, and waited. The vibrations traveled down and came back faintly delayed. Beneath, something dense was moving, slow, rhythmic, almost like a heartbeat. He pressed his ear to the ground and listened. The entire surface was one organism, and the spots that held firm were where the roots were strongest. He remembered how the ridge beneath them had saved them, how its network of roots acted like a skeleton. That was the moment the idea began to form. If the roots could support weight, perhaps they could be harvested, woven, and used to create something stable, something that didn't sink. By the time the fog thickened again, Carter had already removed his boots and waded waist-deep into the swamp, ignoring the cadets' warnings. He followed the rhythm of the pulsing ground, tracing it until he found where two thick roots crossed. They were warm to the touch, pulsing with slow energy, but firm. Using a small blade from his tool belt, he sliced off a fragment and watched it ooze a milky sap before sealing itself. It healed like flesh. He smiled faintly. This world was strange, but it provided its own materials. When he returned to the ridge with the sample, the others stared at him as though he had gone mad. The insectoids hissed in confusion, while Sarai covered her face from the smell. But Carter didn't care. He set the root down, tested its flexibility, and began to twist it between his palms. The fibers interlocked like sinew. It could be braided, bound, maybe even woven into something buoyant. He didn't say much that evening. He just looked at the endless swamp stretching beyond the ridge and felt the faint thump of life beneath his feet. The instructors orbiting above would probably expect failure within 48 hours, like every team before. But he wasn't planning to rebuild the camp on the swamp's terms. He would move it, on top of the swamp, not within it. The first night on Viridian 4 ended with the cadets huddled in silence, exhausted and hopeless, while Carter lay awake, listening to the pulse of the living world below. The swamp had swallowed their gear, but it had also given him the first piece of its secret. It was not just an enemy. It was a tool waiting to be understood. And by morning, he already knew his next move. He would build rafts from the swamp's own veins and make the planet carry them instead of consume them. The trial had only begun, and unlike the others, he had no intention of being swallowed. Morning on Viridian 4 came without sunlight. Instead, the swamp's fog glowed faintly from within, casting everything in a pale green haze that blurred the horizon. The air pulsed with humidity so dense it felt like breathing through cloth. Carter woke before the others, his mind already turning over the strange rhythm he had heard through the ground the night before. He had not slept much, but his exhaustion was sharpened into focus. The swamp was alive in every sense, breathing, shifting, reacting. If he could understand its pattern, he could turn that movement into an advantage. He took his knife, a length of rope, and one of the empty supply crates that had survived, then stepped into the shallow water. The surface rippled with each cautious stride, thick with floating leaves that seemed to rearrange themselves whenever he passed. Behind him, Rose stirred. She was still shaken from nearly drowning the day before, but curious enough to follow his movements from the ridge. "Where are you going?" she asked weakly. Carter didn't look back. "To see how this place holds itself together," he said, and his voice carried oddly across the swamp, bouncing off unseen walls of mist. She hesitated, then sank back into silence, watching as he disappeared into the gray-green expanse. The swamp deepened after 20 meters, becoming a maze of tangled vegetation. The trees that rose from it were unlike anything catalogued, pale trunks spiraling upward, their bark translucent and veined with faint bioluminescence. Carter waded between them, brushing aside thick tendrils that hung like ropes. He kept an eye on the bubbles that marked unstable zones. The rhythm of the pulsing beneath his feet returned, slow and deliberate. Every few minutes, the ground seemed to inhale and exhale, shifting the water's level by centimeters. It was like walking on the lungs of the world. He stopped when the terrain began to rise again, forming a mound overgrown with vines. The roots there were enormous, each thicker than his arm, stretching in every direction, some disappearing into the water, others coiling around tree trunks. He knelt and pressed his palm to one. It vibrated faintly, carrying a current of energy deeper underground. When he pushed harder, the vibration changed pitch, responding to his pressure. The realization came quickly. The roots were alive, sensitive to touch, and possibly aware of weight. That explained why the swamp seemed to decide when to consume or release objects. It reacted to mass and movement. Carter withdrew his knife and cut a small section of the root. The surface resisted at first, then split cleanly, releasing a faint burst of gas that smelled of resin and minerals. The core was fibrous, not woody. He pulled out several strands and noticed how quickly the cut sealed itself behind him. It was as if the organism was trying to heal. He coiled the fibers around his wrist. They flexed easily and did not dissolve in the acidic water. The texture reminded him of braided reed rope, only stronger. He moved methodically, collecting more samples, then used his knife to probe beneath the surface where the roots intertwined. The network extended deep, forming a dense mat that could easily support weight. He stepped on it experimentally, shifting his balance. The root web flexed but held firm, rising slightly before settling again. He smiled faintly. The planet was literally offering him the foundation for what he needed. When he returned to the ridge, the others were already awake and arguing. Varric was pacing, slamming his tail against the ground. Sarai sat with her wings half open, trying to dry them in the thick air. Kess and Voro were tapping furiously on the remains of a communication pad that no longer functioned, while Rose sat apart, hugging her knees. The group looked up as Carter approached, his arms full of wet, pale vines. "What is that supposed to be?" Varric demanded. "Material," Carter answered simply. He dropped the bundle in front of them. "These roots don't dissolve in acid. They're buoyant, and they heal when cut. I think they can carry us." Sarai tilted her head, feathers twitching. "Carry us where? There's nothing but water." "Then we move on water," Carter said. He began twisting the vines together, testing how they interlocked. "If the swamp wants to sink everything solid, then we stop building on it. We build with it." Varric snorted. "Madness. You think we can float a whole camp on weeds?" Carter ignored him. He looped 3 thick strands together, tying them in a sailor's braid. It held firmly even when pulled from both ends. He dipped it into the swamp, then let it go. It bobbed once, twice, then floated steadily. The reaction around him was silence. Even the insectoid twins stopped clicking. Rose stepped forward, cautious curiosity overcoming her fear. "You really think it could work?" she asked softly. "It has to," he said. "We can't rebuild here. The swamp will keep taking. So we move with it, not against it." By midday, he had the group working, though reluctantly. He directed each cadet according to their strengths. Varek, with his raw strength, was ordered to uproot the thicker roots near the ridge. The insectoids used their precision claws to strip fibers from the vines without damaging them. Sarai, whose wings had finally dried, climbed the nearest tree and scouted for higher ground, marking safe zones with colored ribbons torn from their uniforms. Rose stayed beside Carter, helping him weave the roots into wider mats. The process was exhausting. The swamp resisted every movement. Each time they cut a root, the water trembled as if warning them. Once, when Kess hacked too deeply, the ground convulsed violently, sending ripples that nearly knocked everyone off balance. The noise drew distant calls, low, guttural sounds that echoed across the marsh. Carter froze, listening. The planet was awake and aware of their intrusion. But he didn't stop. He just adjusted his technique, cutting smaller sections and sealing each wound with mud before moving on. By the time dusk fell, the first prototype lay stretched across the ridge, a rough platform woven from living roots and dried vines. It looked primitive, but when Carter stepped onto it, it barely moved. He bounced once and nodded. "It'll hold," he said quietly. Sarai hovered nearby, her feathers glistening in the dim light. "What if it sinks in deeper water?" she asked. "Then we learn to make it stronger," he replied. "That's what humans do. We test, we fail, we fix. We don't quit." His calm tone cut through the group's fear like sunlight through fog. For the first time since landing, no one argued. Even Varek, though grumbling, began helping to lash branches across the raft's frame. They worked through the humid night, illuminated by glowing spores drifting in the air. Each of them was too tired to think of pride or difference. All that mattered was survival. When the last knot was tied, Carter stood back and surveyed the result. The raft was large enough for 6 to stand on, though uneven. The swamp beneath it rippled gently, but the platform stayed afloat. He tested its flexibility by pressing down on one edge. It bent, but did not break. Around him, the cadets stared in disbelief. For the first time since arrival, something had worked in their favor. Rose smiled faintly, her amphibian eyes reflecting the faint light. "It's alive," she whispered. "It moves with the water." "That's the point," Carter said. "If the ground can't hold us, the water will. We just have to make it carry us instead of consuming us." He spent the remaining hours reinforcing the edges and teaching the others how to weave the root fibers properly. Each strand had to be twisted while still wet. Once it dried, it hardened into a structure stronger than leather. He realized the roots seemed to respond to warmth. When he held them, they stiffened slightly, as though recognizing the contact. It was eerie, but useful. By dawn, they had 3 smaller rafts connected by vines, forming the beginnings of a floating platform. The fog rolled thicker, and somewhere far beyond, a deep rumble of movement echoed beneath the swamp, like a warning or perhaps acknowledgement. Carter looked out across the endless green expanse. His hands were raw and blistered, his body coated in layers of mud, but his mind was alive with purpose. The swamp was not just hostile terrain, it was a partner that demanded respect. He turned to the exhausted cadets, their faces streaked with grime and disbelief. "Rest now," he said. "Tomorrow we move the camp." No one protested. For the first time, there was a strange, tentative unity among them. The swamp that had tried to consume them now rocked gently beneath their feet, almost like a heartbeat in sync with their own. Carter stood on the edge of the raft, watching the fog pulse in slow waves, and whispered under his breath, not to the cadets, but to the world itself. "If you want to swallow us, You'll have to carry us first." He sat down, the swamp's hum steady beneath him, and for the first time since the mission began, allowed his body to rest. The night no longer felt like an enemy. It felt like the beginning of understanding. The fog never truly lifted on Viridian 4. It only shifted in color, from greenish-gray at dawn to a pale gold shimmer by mid-morning, before falling again into opaque twilight. When Carter awoke, his clothes clung to his skin with damp weight, and every breath tasted of wet earth. The raft beneath him creaked faintly, roots tightening as the morning heat awakened the living fibers. Around him, the cadets stirred in uneasy silence, too exhausted to argue, too hungry to complain. The swamp had starved them into cooperation. Only Carter's steady presence kept the group from collapsing entirely. He climbed off the raft and stepped into waist-deep water. The ground pulsed beneath his boots, alive with that strange rhythm again. He knew now that the swamp's breathing was its cycle of feeding and renewal. The roots expanded and contracted, exchanging gases through the water, and the stronger veins carried both energy and structure through the terrain. He crouched beside one, running his hands along its slick surface. It had thickened since yesterday, growing, adjusting to the presence of the rafts. That meant it could be cultivated. The realization struck him with quiet awe. The planet itself could be coaxed to grow the foundation they needed. Behind him, Ro moved closer, careful not to sink. Her eyes reflected the green mist like mirrors. "You're planning something again, aren't you?" she asked softly. Carter nodded. "We need more than just platforms. We need movement. If we're going to relocate the camp, we need rafts that can carry the equipment we have left. Stronger ones, linked and guided." Her expression flickered between hope and disbelief. "You really think we can move everything?" "We have no choice," he said. "This swamp wants us gone, and I intend to give it exactly that, but on our terms." He spent the next hours exploring the perimeter of their ridge, marking safe root clusters with colored threads. The other cadets soon followed, each assigned to a task. Varric and the insectoid twins harvested thicker roots by cutting and knotting them with precision, while Sarai scouted from above, her thin wings beating softly as she hovered to spot dry patches. The air buzzed with motion and murmured coordination. It was no longer chaos. It was structure, born from necessity. By midday, the group had gathered enough roots to start shaping larger rafts. Carter demonstrated how to weave the vines while they were still moist, showing how the fibers contracted as they dried, binding the frame tightly together. The first raft had been a crude test. These would be stronger, larger, capable of supporting their remaining crates and possibly a small fire pit. Ro worked beside him, following his movements carefully, her long fingers surprisingly adept at tightening knots. Each motion was rhythmic, deliberate. Pull, twist, tie, breathe. It was almost meditative. As the rafts took shape, Carter's mind wandered to his training back on Earth. The disaster drills, the isolation simulations, the endless emphasis on adaptability. He remembered his instructor's words. If you can't control your environment, merge with it. That principle had carried him through deserts, radiation zones, and artificial gravity storms. Now it anchored him here. The difference was that Viridian 4 wasn't just an environment, it was a consciousness. Every time he cut a root or shifted a raft, the swamp seemed to react with subtle pressure, like a deep current pushing back. It was watching. Near sunset, the rafts were ready for testing. The group gathered at the edge of the ridge, silent except for the low hum of insects. Carter pushed the first one into deeper water. It drifted slowly, rocking on the thick soup of the swamp's surface. Then it steadied. He stepped onto it, letting his weight sink the edges slightly. It held. Varric joined him, his massive tail dragging behind, and even then, the raft did not break. A murmur of surprise swept through the group. Carter allowed himself a small grin. "Now we know it works," he said. "Tomorrow we build more, enough to carry everything that's left." The insectoid twins clattered their claws in approval, while Sarai tilted her head, watching the glowing reflection of the raft lights ripple on the surface. "It's strange," she murmured. "It feels like the swamp isn't fighting anymore." Carter nodded. "Maybe it realizes we're not enemies." But the calm didn't last. As darkness fell, the swamp began to stir again. The water around the rafts thickened, bubbling in slow bursts. Something deep below shifted, dragging long shadows through the luminous fog. Ro froze, gripping Carter's arm. "Did you feel that?" "Yes," he said quietly. "It's testing us." Before he could finish, one of the smaller rafts lurched violently. The vines snapped, and the platform began to tilt. The cadets scrambled to stabilize it, but a heavy wave of water rolled in from nowhere, slamming into the structure. A crate of tools slid off and vanished into the blackness. Carter grabbed a pole and jammed it into the mud below, anchoring the main raft before it could drift apart. "Hold it steady," he shouted. "Use the roots. Tie them together." Varric lunged forward, his claws slicing through the air as he grabbed the edge of the raft. Sarai flew above the chaos, throwing down strands of vine for the others to tie. Ro, trembling but focused, wove the roots together faster than Carter could call instructions. Within minutes, the rafts stabilized, connected by an improvised network of ropes and pulsing tendrils. The swamp quieted again, as if satisfied by their reaction. When it was over, Carter stood in the dim light, soaked and trembling from exertion. He stared at the water's surface, watching faint ripples fade. The swamp was alive, but it wasn't mindless. It was intelligent in a way that defied words, testing their resilience like a teacher pushing a student. He wiped his face with a muddy sleeve and looked at the cadets. "You see what this means?" he said breathlessly. "It reacts to what we do. It's learning from us," Varric growled. "Or hunting us." "Maybe both," Carter admitted. "But if it's alive enough to challenge us, it can also recognize cooperation. We're staying on its surface, not inside it. It needs to learn that we're not food." Through the long night, the group repaired the damage, reinforcing every joint and lash. Carter worked until his hands bled, his body shaking with fatigue, but his mind burned with determination. Each raft became sturdier, more complex, woven with both alien precision and human ingenuity. He taught the others how to balance tension in the ropes, how to interlace the living roots with dead ones to create flexibility. Ro proved especially skilled, adapting his designs with natural intuition, suggesting knots that tightened when wet. Sarai learned to layer dried leaves into mats that prevented water from seeping through. Even Varric, though skeptical, followed orders without complaint. By the time the first pale light returned, their floating platform had tripled in size. 3 rafts were now joined into one wide surface, sturdy enough to hold all 7 of them and what remained of their supplies. It wasn't elegant, but it was alive. The roots hummed faintly beneath their feet, responding to the weight and motion above. The swamp's hostility seemed to fade into uneasy truce. Carter stood at the front, looking out into the endless expanse of water. The fog stretched for miles, broken only by the faint outlines of distant tree columns rising like spires. Somewhere out there, he knew, was higher ground, something stable enough to rebuild on. But now he also wondered if stability was even the goal. Perhaps survival meant accepting motion, not resisting it. Ro joined him at the edge, her gaze fixed on the same horizon. "It's strange," she said quietly. "Yesterday I thought this place wanted to kill us. Now it feels like it's guiding us." He looked down at the roots binding the rafts together. "Maybe it is," he said. "Or maybe it's waiting to see if we're worth keeping alive." For a moment, the fog parted just enough to reveal a faint glow ahead, a soft golden shimmer hovering above the water. It could have been a reflection, or something else entirely. Carter's pulse quickened. He pointed toward it. "That's where we're going next." Ro frowned. "And if it's another trap?" "Then we'll build more rafts," he said simply, "and keep moving." The swamp pulsed once beneath them, slow and deep, as if in acknowledgement. The roots tightened around the raft edges, anchoring them in harmony with the water's rhythm. The cadets rested where they stood, exhausted but alive, unaware that their small act of cooperation had just changed the test itself. Above them, invisible in orbit, the instructor monitoring their progress watched in silence, recording the first instance of the swamp's bioluminescent field aligning with the heartbeat patterns of a human being. Carter didn't know it yet, but the world had started to recognize him, not as an intruder, but as part of its living system. And in the pulse of the roots beneath his feet, he felt the faintest hint of something like acceptance. The following day dawned unnaturally still, as if the swamp itself was holding its breath. The fog was thicker than usual, swallowing sound and color until even the closest trees looked like silhouettes drawn in smoke. Carter stood on the front raft, his boots half submerged in the thin film of water that collected overnight. The surface trembled faintly beneath him, not from the wind, but from something deeper, an unseen pulse that had changed rhythm since the night before. It was slower now, heavier, like a heartbeat burdened with thought. He could feel it underfoot, and it made his skin crawl. He was the first to sense that the balance they had achieved was beginning to shift. The swamp had tolerated their floating camp long enough, but something about the raft's expansion had stirred resistance. The roots around the edges twitched slightly when touched, and sometimes when he looked away, he thought he saw small ripples forming against the current, as though the swamp was testing the boundaries of its guests. He did not tell the others yet. There was no reason to infect their fragile confidence with fear. Instead, he worked quietly, checking the connections between the rafts and reinforcing them with fresh vines. Behind him, Roe was boiling a small pot of water over the first working fire they had managed to maintain for more than an hour. The smoke curled into the fog, creating ghostly shapes that vanished almost as soon as they appeared. Her voice was soft when she spoke. "The roots are getting warmer," she said, looking down at the surface. "I can feel it through the floor." "I know," Carter replied without turning. "It's reacting to us." She hesitated. "Reacting how?" He pulled the rope tight around one of the joints. "I'm not sure yet, but it feels like it's thinking about something." Varek emerged from the fog, carrying a bundle of roots over one shoulder. His scales glistened with moisture, and his expression was grim. "You're both imagining it," he grunted. "The swamp isn't alive. It's just soil and slime pretending to breathe." Carter looked up at him and said calmly, "Then why does the ground move when you speak too loudly?" The reptilian frowned but said nothing more. He dropped the roots and went to help the insectoid twins secure the edges of the supply raft. Sarai circled above them, wings dragging through the heavy mist, calling down coordinates for their next move. Her voice echoed strangely, warped by the humidity. Everything on Viridian 4 seemed to twist sound and sense into something uncertain. By midday, the fog began to thin, revealing a wide expanse of water ahead. The group had decided to move the entire camp toward the shimmering light Carter had seen the night before. The rafts, now connected by long vines, formed a chain that drifted slowly under the gentle push of poles and paddles carved from root bark. It was a strange, almost peaceful rhythm. The sound of the water slapping against the vines, the quiet murmurs of the crew as they guided the makeshift fleet through the swamp's maze. For a few hours, it felt as if they were finally being accepted. Then the resistance began. It started with a faint tug under the rafts, so subtle that Carter thought it was just the current shifting. But the pull grew stronger, dragging the last raft sideways until the ropes creaked under tension. The insectoid twins hissed in alarm as the vines stretched taut, and Roe nearly lost her balance as the raft lurched. Carter grabbed one of the poles and jammed it into the mud below to anchor them. The pole sank deeper than it should have, too deep, as if the ground had turned to liquid. "Something's moving under us," he said sharply. "Hold the lines tight." Before anyone could respond, the entire raft convulsed. A wave of motion rippled through the water, sending vibrations up through the roots and into their feet. The swamp's surface split in places, releasing bursts of gas that stank of rot and iron. From the depths, long strands of vegetation rose, thicker than any vine they had seen before. They whipped through the air like serpents, wrapping around the raft's edges, pulling downward. Rose screamed as one of the tendrils coiled around her leg, yanking her toward the edge. Carter lunged and caught her by the shoulders, digging his heels into the slippery planks. "Cut it!" he shouted. Varek drew his blade and slashed through the vine, which recoiled with a sound like a hiss. The severed piece writhed for a moment before sinking back beneath the surface. The swamp erupted into chaos. More tendrils rose, striking at random, some pulling, others probing the air like blind predators. The rafts buckled under the strain. Sarai dove low, shouting directions, while the insectoid twins scrambled to tie off the corners that were breaking apart. The whole structure began to drift, pulled by invisible currents. Carter forced himself to stay focused. Panic would kill them faster than the swamp could. "Anchor everything!" he yelled. "Use the poles! Stab them deep!" He and Varek worked side by side, driving sharpened stakes into the roots beneath the surface. The swamp resisted, but the poles eventually caught hold, slowing their drift. Ro clung to one of the support beams, her chest heaving, eyes wide with terror. "It's angry!" she cried. Carter didn't answer immediately. He was watching the movement of the vines, noticing how they avoided certain spots. The roots pulsing beneath the rafts were repelling the attacking tendrils, creating a faint vibration that pushed them back. That meant the living roots recognized the rafts as part of themselves now, or at least as extensions of something not to be consumed. He shouted over the noise, "Stay close to the center. The rafts are part of the same network. It won't attack its own." The cadets obeyed, crawling toward the middle platform as the swamp continued to thrash around them. The sound was overwhelming, a wet symphony of suction, cracking wood, and hissing steam. Carter's muscles burned as he held onto one of the ropes to keep the sections together. The air shimmered with heat from the reaction below, and bubbles the size of fists burst at the surface, releasing hot bursts of gas. Then, as suddenly as it had begun, the assault stopped. The water settled, the tendrils sank, and the swamp went still again. The only sound left was the labored breathing of the survivors. Steam rose from the surface, curling into thin ribbons that disappeared into the pale sky. For a long moment, no one spoke. Finally, Varek spat into the water and muttered, "If this thing's alive, it just tried to eat us." Carter crouched, dipping his hand into the water. It was warm, warmer than before. "Not eat," he said quietly. "Test." "Test?" Ro's voice was barely more than a whisper. "Yes," he replied. "It wants to know if we can hold together. It pushes, and we push back. It's like it's measuring us." Sarai landed on the nearest raft, wings trembling. "That's insane." "Maybe," he said, looking out across the vast expanse. "But it's also learning. Every time we build, it reacts differently. It's adapting, and so are we. If we fight it, it will destroy us. But if we move with it, use its own rhythm, we might survive." He stood and signaled for everyone to regroup. The rafts were damaged but still functional. Using the remaining rope, they reconnected the sections and began patching the gaps with dried leaves and reinforced roots. The swamp allowed them to work, almost as if it was watching again, waiting to see what they would do next. As dusk fell, the air cooled slightly, and the fog thinned enough for Carter to see the faint glow ahead once more. The golden shimmer still hung above the water, distant but constant. He pointed toward it. "That's our destination. Whatever that is, the swamp is trying to stop us from reaching it." Varek grunted. "Then why go there?" "Because it's where the current wants to take us," Carter said. "And if the swamp's alive, then that's where it's leading us, one way or another." The group fell silent. Even Ro, who looked ready to collapse, nodded slowly. The attack had shaken her, but it had also proven that Carter's leadership was the only thing keeping them alive. The others began preparing for another move, securing what remained of their supplies and testing the repaired rafts. When night finally descended, the swamp was strangely peaceful. Bioluminescent spores drifted above the water, forming soft constellations that reflected off the surface. The rafts rocked gently, and the group huddled together under makeshift coverings of woven leaves. Carter sat apart, staring at the faint glow in the distance. He could feel the swamp's pulse beneath him again, slower, more deliberate now. It was no longer a random rhythm, but something resembling thought. He realized, with a mixture of awe and unease, that the swamp wasn't trying to destroy them anymore. It was communicating. Each attack, each movement, each tremor, it was a dialogue in a language of pressure and pulse. The planet was watching him, learning from him, maybe even acknowledging him as part of its strange living system. He whispered under his breath, "All right then. Let's see what you're really hiding out there." The fog ahead shifted in response, glowing faintly as though the swamp had heard him and accepted the challenge. And as the others slept, Carter stayed awake, listening to the deep pulse of the world, preparing for whatever waited beyond the mist. The morning came softly, with the pale shimmer of light diffusing through the fog, turning the swamp into a sea of silver and green. The air was quiet again, not with peace, but with expectancy. Every living sound, the low croak of unseen amphibians, the slow drip of condensation from leaves, seemed suspended, as if the entire planet was waiting for the next decision. Carter stood on the edge of the main raft, his hands resting on the rough ropes that held their floating camp together. The glow he had seen for days now burned stronger in the distance, pulsing faintly like a beacon. It wasn't the color of the swamp's bioluminescence. It was warmer, golden, steady. He knew it wasn't natural. The swamp resisted all that didn't belong to it, yet this light seemed untouched. Ro joined him quietly, her steps barely audible on the living surface. Her skin shimmered faintly with moisture, her voice hoarse from lack of sleep. "It's closer now," she said. "It almost feels like it's calling us." He nodded. "It wants us to see something. We've come too far to stop." Behind them, the others prepared for the journey. Sarai secured the upper sails made of stretched leaves to catch the faint breeze drifting across the swamp. The insectoid twins worked in silence, tightening ropes around the raft joints, their movements fast and synchronized. Even Varek, usually cynical and impatient, moved with grim purpose. The group no longer questioned Carter's choices. The swamp had tested them, and his leadership had carried them through. Now, they followed him without hesitation. When the last vine was tied and the camp ready to move, Carter gave a short nod. "Let's go," he said simply. The rafts began to drift, pushed by the current and guided by the poles that cut gently through the shallow water. The fog parted slowly as they moved, revealing an endless expanse of roots and fallen trees. Strange, luminous insects hovered above the water, their reflections forming wavering constellations on the surface. The air was thick with the smell of damp vegetation, but beneath it lingered something new, a faint sweetness, almost floral. Hours passed in silence. The swamp's rhythm had changed again. Its pulse no longer felt aggressive. Instead, it matched the slow, deliberate beat of the water against the rafts. It felt almost like cooperation. Carter noticed that the roots beneath them now glowed faintly when touched, spreading soft trails of light through the murk. The swamp was reacting to their movement, illuminating the path ahead. Ro watched in awe. "It's showing us the way," she whispered. "Or marking where it wants us to go," Carter replied. "Either way, we follow." By late afternoon, the fog thinned enough for the source of the golden light to appear. Ahead, rising from the swamp's surface, stood a massive structure unlike anything the cadets had ever seen. It was not built, but grown. An enormous network of roots twisting upward to form a circular platform, elevated above the water. Bioluminescent veins pulsed through its surface, converging into a single core that glowed with a steady golden radiance. Around it, the swamp was perfectly still, as if this place was the heart from which all life on Viridian 4 spread. Carter stared at it, speechless for a moment. The others joined him, their expressions ranging from disbelief to reverence. Varric was the first to break the silence. "That's impossible. Nothing grows like that." "It's not just growth," Carter said slowly. "It's design." He guided the rafts closer until the roots of the great platform reached out to meet them. The vines moved as if alive, extending tendrils that wrapped gently around the raft edges, pulling them into a slow docking motion. The swamp accepted their arrival, welcoming them to the center of its body. When the rafts touched the platform, the vibration beneath their feet deepened into a steady hum. Slow, powerful, rhythmic. The sound resonated in Carter's chest like a heartbeat. He climbed up first, using the vines as handholds. The surface was warm under his palms, faintly damp but solid. The others followed, moving cautiously but unable to resist the pull of curiosity. At the center of the platform, a pool of clear liquid shimmered. It wasn't swamp water. It was transparent and radiant, glowing from within like captured sunlight. The air above it was dry, pure, untouched by the decay that filled the rest of the world. Ro knelt beside the pool, staring into it. Her reflection wavered, then slowly merged with something else, an image that looked like the network of roots stretching far below them. She gasped and looked up. "It's alive," she said softly. "It's showing us its mind." Carter approached the edge of the pool. He could feel a faint pull in his thoughts, like static brushing the edge of consciousness. The swamp wasn't just a biological system. It was something more, an integrated organism that remembered, learned, and adapted. Its trials had not been random acts of hostility, but processes of selection. The world had been testing who could understand it without destroying it. As he stared into the glowing water, fragments of images flickered within it. Other camps sinking, other species struggling and failing, fire consuming the roots, metal tearing into the soil. Every attempt to dominate the swamp had ended in destruction. But now, the vision shifted, showing their own rafts drifting gently across the water, built from the swamp's own living veins, existing in balance instead of opposition. The light brightened, pulsing in slow approval. Ro stepped back, awe softening her features. "It chose us," she whispered. Carter shook his head. "No, it chose understanding." He turned to the others. "This is the final test. The swamp doesn't want survivors. It wants partners. Every team before us tried to conquer it, to force stability. We adapted. That's why it let us through." The insectoid twins clicked softly, a sound of quiet agreement. Sarai lowered her head, wings folded in solemn respect. Even Varric, stubborn and proud, had no words. The air around them grew warmer, the golden glow intensifying until the entire platform shimmered like a living sun. The instructor, orbiting far above, watching through the drone feeds, marked the data with disbelief. The swamp's electromagnetic field had synchronized perfectly with the humans' heartbeats. The trial, designed to measure resilience, had revealed something entirely different: coexistence. Carter knelt by the pool and dipped his hand into the glowing water. It was warm, pulsing gently against his skin. A sensation filled him, not words but meaning, raw and profound. The swamp wasn't just alive, it was ancient, self-sustaining, and lonely. It had guarded its ecosystem for millennia, devouring anything that threatened its balance. Humanity, for once, had not sought to dominate but to adapt. It understood that survival was not victory, but harmony. The swamp recognized that. When he withdrew his hand, faint trails of golden light clung to his fingers, fading slowly. He looked around at the others, then back at the water. "We're done," he said quietly. "We passed." That evening, the group rebuilt their camp atop the great platform. The rafts were secured around it, forming a floating village that drifted with the swamp's currents instead of resisting them. Fires burned low and steady, and for the first time since landing, the air felt safe to breathe. The swamp's pulse had changed again, slow, calm, almost content. The cadets spoke little, too overwhelmed by what they had seen, but their silence was peaceful rather than fearful. Ro sat beside Carter as the night deepened, the golden light from the pool reflecting in her eyes. "Do you think anyone will believe us when we return?" she asked softly. He smiled faintly. "Maybe not, but that's not what matters." "What does?" she asked. He looked out across the endless swamp, where the fog shimmered like silk under the moonlight. "That we learned how to live inside something we didn't understand. That we stopped trying to own everything we touched." For a long time, neither of them spoke. The swamp hummed gently beneath them, its rhythm now matching the calm beat of human hearts. The golden light dimmed, no longer demanding attention, but resting in quiet unity. Somewhere far above, the orbiting drone recorded its final data stream before shutting down, leaving the planet undisturbed. By dawn, the fog lifted enough to reveal the horizon, a rare, breathtaking sight. The swamp stretched endlessly, but now it seemed alive with purpose, its surface dotted with new shoots and glowing roots that spread outward like veins of gold. The ecosystem was already healing, reshaping itself around the new balance that had been formed. Carter watched in silence, his face illuminated by the first true sunlight they had seen since arriving. He didn't need confirmation from the Academy or data from orbit. The world itself had spoken. They had entered it as invaders, and it had turned them into something else: students, allies, caretakers. He closed his eyes and listened to the slow, steady pulse beneath his feet, the heartbeat of a living planet that had finally accepted them. And in that moment, he knew that survival wasn't about endurance or strength. It was about harmony, the quiet understanding between two forms of life that had learned at last to carry each other.